Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of our Ghost series. This one is set in the Port Arthur settlement, way back when the convicts were there. It seems that this settlement is so haunted, I've had to break it into two parts to tell you about all the ghosts that have haunted there, and possibly a demonic being. We've only briefly touched on Port Arthur previously. More of the Van Diemen's demons had come out of Sarah Island, which was the penal settlement set up before Port Arthur. But, as it's been recorded, Port Arthur is just as haunted. Maybe more so. Situated about 100 kilometres or 62 miles by road southeast of Hobart, Port Arthur is the best preserved penal settlement in Australia. It was named after George Arthur, the Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, which is now known as the island state of Tassie. Shiploads of convicts, men, women and children, were transported here from England for crimes which could be as petty as stealing a loaf of bread. Well over 1,000 prisoners died at Port Arthur during its brutal 47-year history as a penal colony in the mid to late 1800s. Many of them as a result of flogging, starvation, murder, suicide, attempted escape and hanging. Of the 1,646 graves on the offshore island of the dead, only those of staff and military personnel are marked. The rest have been condemned to anonymity for eternity. At Port Arthur, these prisoners were often treated to the most inhumane treatment imaginable. Chained for weeks at a time, forbidden to speak, or even hanged for their misdemeanours. It was recorded that boys as young as 9 were used for hard labour. Solitary confinement cells in the separate prison building inflicted mental punishment in place of floggings, and as a result, many developed mental illnesses from the lack of light and sound. Port Arthur was not a happy place. It's hardly surprising that ghostly occurrences have been reported at the site since 1870. But what is surprising is that the earliest of these were not necessarily the anguished ghosts of earthbound convicts. In 1842, the Colonial Secretary in London authorised the building of the Parsonage at Port Arthur. It was a double-storied building intended perhaps to indicate the senior status of the clergyman in their midst. The Reverend George Eastman was chaplain from 1855 to 1870. A large convivial man, good on the tooth, was known amongst the convicts as the good parson. More like the hungry parson. It is recorded that when a convict's time had expired, Reverend George Eastman always had some money to help them on their way. So, in contrast to the flogging parson we know, good old Samuel Marsden, Reverend Eastman was a nice guy. So that was one thing they had down in Port Arthur. In April 1870, Eastman was unwell in bed at the parsonage when a call came through for him to attend a dying prisoner at a distant outstation. Putting duty before his own health, he visited the man, but caught a chill in the process, which developed into pneumonia. He died 2 days later. He was a man of enormous girth and died in an upstairs bedroom. His empty coffin was manoeuvred up the narrow stairs, but when filled, it was found to be too heavy to be brought out the same way. A rope was rigged to lower the coffin from the bedroom window to the ground. But halfway lowering the man down, the rope snapped. The coffin fell and the bloated corpse of the late lamented clergyman tumbled into the garden. For many years after that, people reported smelling putrefying flesh, hearing moaning or morbid screams, and strange lights inside the parsonage. Some claim Reverend Eastman's corpse reappeared from time to time, spread-eagled in the garden where it had so ingloriously landed. Well, that'd be quite a sight. There were many mourners at Reverend George Eastman's funeral service, being that he was such a nice guy and all. It was on the Isle of the Dead that he was buried. It was quite strange, as on his headstone was written a passage from the Bible, the Hebrews 11:4. He being dead yet speaketh. Possibly at the time meaning that obviously his word will go forth. Perhaps Reverend Eastman saw that inscription differently, as it wasn't to be the last time Reverend Eastman would have his presence felt. A new successor to Eastman was Reverend Hayward. He moved into the parsonage along with his wife and children. There was also a photographer and journalist from the Hobart newspaper, The Clipper, named George Grunsell, and he would often stay in Port Arthur and made some accounts at the time of what was happening through his newspaper. He would also be witness to some of the ghostly going-ons. He writes in one article of The Clipper from the 19th of August 1893, "The doctor, McCarthy by name I believe, seeing the lights shining from various upstairs rooms in the parsonage, concluded that the Hayward family had arrived from Hobart. He accordingly paid a visit to welcome them on their return and rang the front bell for admission. Mr. Hayward opened the door and the doctor made known the cause of his visit. Mr. Hayward informed the doctor that they had not arrived yet. Not arrived? I made sure they had come, and seeing the lights upstairs, concluded Miss Hayward must be busy upstairs putting things in order. Mr. Hayward stared at him in astonishment and assured the doctor he must be mistaken, as there was only the servant and himself in the house at this time, and they were both in the kitchen at the back, and had not even been upstairs. Therefore, there could not have been any lights. Dr. McCarthy, being so insistent, made sure that they both inspected the rooms, but found them all in darkness. While this may not be an outstanding example of spirit manifestation, George Grunsell assured his readers that others in the settlement had seen the lights as well, and they were a subject of speculation during the following day. Remember too, in those days it was hardly a matter of forgotten electrical light switch. Rather, each wick had to be ignited by hand to produce light. Further incidents of inexplicable light followed. One evening, Mr. and Mrs. Hayward were sitting in the drawing room upstairs. The door was open. Suddenly they were struck by the appearance of a most intense light, which streamed from under the door of a room on the opposite side of the landing. The room was used as a study. Creeping cautiously up, Mr. Hayward peeped through the keyhole, and to his astonishment could see the interior as though brilliantly lighted up with gas. He turned to the handle and opened the door, when lo and behold, all was in sudden darkness again. The next instance happened several months later, this time with independent reliable witnesses. Sir Valentine and Lady Fleming were staying at the parsonage, and the subject of the mysterious lights was discussed. Sir Valentine, whom was a judge, as a visitor, Grunsell described him, too old a stager and too matter-of-fact to believe there was anything so uncanny, and laughed off the whole affair, but he was soon to change his attitude. The lights appeared again exactly as the previous occasion. They peeped through the keyhole. They opened the door, but to no purpose. The result was the same as before. Sir Valentine gravely shook his head and suggested a thorough examination of the premises by daylight. According with the doctor's assistance, an investigation took place, but nothing would account for the lights. On another occasion, Mrs. Hayward had a puzzling experience. It was her habit to go around the parsonage every night to ensure that all doors and windows were safely locked and barred against intruders. I mean, you don't want any convicts turning up, do you? George Grunsell had written in the Clipper on the 26th of August of 1893 this account. On descending early one morning to let the manservant in from the penitentiary, she was amazed to find a candle burning in a candlestick on a chair in the middle of the kitchen. Who lit the candle or how it got there remained a mystery. Had it been burning all night, it would have been burnt out. Besides, Mrs. Hayward was quite certain it was not there when she locked up. Perhaps the good parson was merely attempting to shed much-needed light on the colony. A few years later, another, and this time a less benevolent spirit, would begin to pay regular visits to the parsonage. It was said that there were foul smells and an apparition of a large bearded man threatening unwanted visitors. At one time, the Roman Catholic chaplain was called away, leaving his sister alone in their home. Reverend Hayward and his wife invited her to be a guest at the parsonage during her brother's absence. She gladly accepted, blissfully unaware of the terror she would soon experience. The lady was made comfortable in the guest bedroom on the ground floor, a front room on the right of the main entrance of the parsonage. She had not been there many days when the Haywards, sleeping upstairs, heard loud knocking and banging from the ground floor. Grunsell reports in the Clipper. Presently they heard a piercing scream, and a moment afterwards their lady friend rushed up the stairs in the greatest terror and burst into their bedroom. Having struck a light and pacified her to some extent, they learned that she was awakened by a knocking sound in her room. Thinking it to be rats in the skirting, she reached out and tussled her boots about without effect. Presently it seemed to be all over the floor and under the bed. She was so worked up that she could stand it no longer, and letting out a scream, rushed up into Mrs. Hayward's bedroom. She declared she heard the patter of feet following her up the stairs. As their visitor was too frightened to return downstairs to her bed, a shakedown was made for her in the study, the room in which the light had appeared a few years earlier. Reverend Hayward did not go downstairs to check on the source of the knocking, but contented himself by looking over at the banisters before retiring to his room, closing the doors firmly. This was no sooner done, Grunsell wrote, than rap, rap, rap was heard upon the same door on the outside. He at once opened it and found darkness, only that and nothing more. The next manifestation was particularly startling, especially for the maid who experienced it. The guest bedroom, from where the chaplain's sister fled, had remained unoccupied for some time. One Saturday, after the maid scrubbed the floor, she lit a fire to dry the room and freshen the air. After dark, she returned to check the fire. Suddenly, she let out a spine-chilling shriek and fell to the floor senseless. Grunsell writes in the Clipper, "The Haywards rushed in and endeavoured by all means in their power, smelling salts, cold water, burnt feathers, etc., to restore her to consciousness, but in vain. As a last resort, Reverend Hayward placed her head between his knees and soundly boxed her ears." So he gave her a bit of a smack. This brought her around. Nothing like a good smack to the head. But it was some time before the girl was sufficiently calm to explain what had happened. At last she did, when she declared that on entering the room she distinctively saw the figure of a man in a peculiar garment looking at her through the window and grasping in his hand a knife or dagger, which he held as though about to strike. Ooh, grasping a knife or dagger. This was certainly not the good parson returning to bring joy and goodwill to the colony. George Grunsell commented that ever afterward the maid refused to enter that room again after dark. Hardly surprising. The room became known by the family, Grunsell wrote, as the haunted room. It was placed at Grunsell's disposal during one of his visits, but he denies being disturbed by any apparitions while staying there. However, Grunsell did share one unusual experience with Reverend Haywood. One evening, while descending the stairs in the dark, he recalled, "I was about 2 stairs behind him, and we both had our hands on the banister. All at once he stopped and called out, 'Is that you, Marty?' Marty was his eldest son of 12 years. Receiving no reply, he asked again with a like result. He then called for a light to be brought, and although we searched, not a soul was near. He declared that he most distinctly felt a hand placed upon his on the banister and again withdrawn. He thought it was his boy playing him a trick in the dark, but it was not so." The final parsonage incident during the Haywoods' residency occurred one night when George Grunsell was guesting in the haunted room downstairs. The family were also entertaining Mrs. Haywood's mother and sister, Mrs. and Miss Price, who were occupying a large room with 2 windows upstairs, shared with one of the young Haywood children. Mrs. Price was a very strong-minded lady, Grunsell emphasised while recounting this story. She had seen far too much to cause her to be easily frightened. Grunsell continues in the paper. On one particular night, during her visit, Mrs. Price was unable to sleep. She lay with her eyes open. The moon was shining, and with its dim light just made the interior of the room visible to her sight. Suddenly, she became conscious that somebody had entered her room, and glancing toward the door, beheld a human figure draped in white. Her first thought was to make a move or to speak, but it struck her that the intruder might be a burglar in disguise, intent upon robbing her, and to attract attention to herself might possibly mean something serious against her life. She therefore lay motionless, but with half-open eyes, following the movements of the supposed burglar. The mysterious figure, having entered the room, went through the motions of striking a match upon the wall, and immediately afterwards there was the appearance of light as from a lucifer, a self-igniting match. This done, it then made its way round the foot of the bed to a cot in which one of the children slept. For a moment it stood looking at the sleeping child, then turning round, glided silently out of the room and was gone. Mrs. Price told of her experience the next morning, which caused no end of speculation as to who or what the ghost might be. The Haywoods and their guests were probably the first people to see ghosts at the parsonage, but they were certainly not to be the last. Soon after these experiences took place, Port Arthur closed as a penal colony in 1877. Some surrounding land was auctioned off, and the last of the convicts were sent elsewhere. The Haywoods moved away and the parsonage became privately owned. An era had finished. Then the bushfires of 1895 and 97 ravaged the Tasman Peninsula and destroyed a number of the Port Arthur buildings. The parsonage was badly damaged and later remodelled as a single-storey structure. But the ghostly story of the parsonage was far from over. The heritage supervisor during the restoration of the Port Arthur site in 1980 tells an interesting tale. A group of tradesmen staying in the parsonage while doing renovations were driven from the building after a terrifying night of strange and seemingly supernatural events, including unexplained bangs and bumps, and one tradesman being pinned down on his bed by an invisible entity. Another worker reported seeing a woman dressed in white who was accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature and billowing curtains. Could the woman in white be the same apparition seen by Mrs. Price over a century earlier, the one who had made its way around the foot of the bed to a cot in which one of the Hayward children slept? If so, then she appears to be a peaceful and loving soul. Perhaps she lost a child and endlessly searches for it, or maybe she was a convict and therefore denied the opportunity to have children of her own, so now delights in watching over others. The woman in white might even be the young bride of the accountant who lived next door to the parsonage. According to letters inherited by descendants of the English side of her family, the young woman felt intimidated and restricted at Port Arthur and found comfort in her friendship with her neighbour, the parson's wife. Sadly, the young woman died while giving birth to a stillborn child, and her unbaptised infant was buried in the parsonage gardens. Well, there you go. Case closed. The letters she had written to her family at home were kept safe and handed down through many generations. Eventually they came into the possession of a couple who visited Australia and were hoping to fill in some gaps in their family tree. According to Peter Richmond, producer of the 2003 doc Ghosts of Port Arthur, during a visit to Port Arthur, the couple walked past the parsonage one afternoon and took a photo of the building. And when it was developed, they found an image of a baby clearly visible in the left corner. So perhaps he and his mother are still searching for one another. Over the years since the original occurrence in 1870, manifestations at the parsonage have become increasingly violent. These days, no one spends the night in the parson's house. Laughter and footsteps seem harmless enough, but there is something eerie about the old house at night. It is as though locked windows and closed doors hold back a host of unhappy demons. And rightly so, it was a penal settlement. I mean, how many people died there? Speaking of demons, there was a story of Mark Jeffries, who was an Irishman doing time at Port Arthur for manslaughter. He was given the task of gravedigger on the Isle of the Dead. He lived on the Isle of the Dead in a hut and only got to go back to the mainland on weekends, typically for church. One night, the men of the mainland saw a flare lit up on the Isle of the Dead and went to investigate. When they got there, they found Mark Jeffries, huge man, curled up, quivering in the fetal position. He said that the previous night his hut shook violently. A red glow emanated from within. He said that he was visited by His Satanic Majesty, and his eyes glowed red with heat as the stench of sulphur engulfed him in smoke. Well, there's our demon, if Mark Jeffrey could be believed. But it was said that he was quite shaken up, all alone on the Isle of the Dead. Something to chew over. Yes, Port Arthur is quite the creepy place. Demons, spirits. It's no wonder it's such a sought-after place to visit. And Tasmania has so much history in such a small place. Could it be Australia's most haunted state? What do you think? Don't forget to like, subscribe and share. And join us shortly for part 2 of Port Arthur's creepiest settlement stories.
Congratulations, Bernard. What a fall. All the way down the stairs. Wonderful. But then you always were good at falling from a great height. can't compare, my dear Geoffrey, with your famous death scenes, which you have played so brilliantly for so many years, bitch.